Hello everyone, welcome back to the TAPED podcast, the most fearless podcast in the world. We are your hosts, as always, myself, Mickey T.
And me, Nostalgia.
And today we're going to be doing another one of our album recaps. We're going to be going over the albums that were released during April of 2021. We were meant to do this a while ago, but obviously, we took a break, but we are back in full swing of things. And I think you all know the drill if you kept up with this. We just talk about big releases that came out. And this month, I think it had a few decent moments, but generally speaking, it was a pretty okay month. It was kind of mid, in all honesty. But
I'm with you.
So we won't waste any more time. We'll just get right into it. We will start with the first release of the month, and that is Godspeed at State's End by Godspeed, You Black Emperor. Oh god, I hate that title so much.
Yeah.
This is the 7th studio album from the legendary Canadian instrumental and post-rock collective Godspeed, You Black Emperor. And before I listened to this album, I went ahead and listened to every other Godspeed album that the band released prior. And I could see why Godspeed are so loved in the post-rock field, considering records like The Debut and, of course, Lift Your Skinny Fists. And with their 2010s catalogue, I felt like it kind of stumbled in quality after Alleluia. I was kind of hopeful that this record would be better because it was getting very positive reception and reviews. And I think that this album is pretty good for what it is. What holds this album back for me, however, is the simple fact that Godspeed just don't really seem to do much to drive their sound forward and innovate in any new or creative way. It just seems like Godspeed are just sticking to their guns and trying their best to do what they attempted to do on their last couple of albums, but better. And if that's the case, then they succeeded, to be fair, because there's a lot to like about this album. Sound-wise, it's very atmospheric and often dissonant in that Godspeed fashion. And the pieces that we see on this album are really great when they're at their best. The album itself is well composed, well performed, and dynamic. Some of the best tracks they've made post-hiatus are on this album, and while it doesn't go the extra mile and comes off like a little bit of a directionless take, most of it works and sounds fantastic. It doesn't live up to the quality of some of their earlier albums, obviously, and suffers from some of the same issues that the 2010s efforts suffered from. But I like it. It stands as one of the better post-rock releases of 2021, and it's a much-needed boost for the collective, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's going to go down as the collective's defining release by any means. And I do agree it's not really a release that covers any unpredictable or foreign ground for them. But it sure as fuck is a very welcome helping of some of the most fulfilling post-rock they've released in a long while. And an endeavour which, more often than not, sees the collective play to their strengths and create very dark yet epic soundscapes, full of very suspenseful and intense moments. That also contains some very serene and uplifting moments too. It's basically what you'd expect from Godspeed. It's consistently engaging and impressive, but overall I do think it kind of lacks those intensely breathtaking moments that Godspeed you have consistently delivered over the past few years. It doesn't quite have the highs that some of their best albums do. It doesn't feel quite as cathartic. But, the release is still a very solid one, and it's definitely a welcome one after a few, not really bad, but a bit underwhelming releases, I would say.
I completely agree. And my favourite tracks from Godspeed at State's End are Fire at Static Valley, Government Came, Cliff Gaze at Empty Waters Rise, and First of the Last Glaciers. My least favourite track is Job's Lament, and I gave this album a decent 7.
My favourite tracks are Job's Lament, Government Came, Cliff's Gaze, and Our Side Has to Win. My least favourite track is Military Alphabet, and I gave this album a light 7 out of 10.
Next we have New Long Leg by Dry Cleaning. This is the debut album from the UK post-punk band. I don't really have a whole lot to say about this album, honestly. All I hoped was that this band would leave a good first impression on me, and I could certainly respect what they were trying to do on this album, but honestly, I was just left quite bored for the whole thing. Instrumentally, a lot of the compositions and the production is decent, and I love a lot of the bass lines on here, but a lot of it is very rudimentary for the genre, and it doesn't really come off very memorable or interesting. It just sounds like any average bit of post-punk, honestly. And this is coming from someone who fucking loves post-punk. While I think that the snarky and artsy style of the lyricism on here is pretty interesting, the whole vibe gets ruined by a lot of the spoken word, as it's delivered in this very flat delivery by the front woman, and she doesn't really stray away from that one delivery, and it gets very tedious to me. You know, often to the point where it just makes these already average tracks all the more boring for me, so it was pretty tough to sit through on my end anyway. You know, it's not that memorable for me. I'd just be wasting time here if I just talk about it any further, as I'd just be repeating myself.
Yeah, you know, post-punk is already quite saturated as it is, honestly, and a record like this new dry cleaning project just doesn't have what it takes to solidify a place for itself among the quote-unquote upper echelon of post-punk releases in recent times. Instrumentally, it's quite clean, it's satisfying. Yeah, oftentimes I think it's a little too understated. It really doesn't leave any sort of lasting impression on me. But then also mixed with the very deadpan spoken word vocals, the album's pace is just really slow. It's the equivalent of a tractor on a motorway or something. It doesn't go anywhere. It just kind of meanders and meanders. And, you know, there are some pretty cool moments, but overall it's really, really slow paced, and it really kind of drags on.
Yep, I agree. Excuse me. Alright, my favourite tracks from New Long Leg are the title track, Leafy, and her Hippo. And my least favourite tracks are John Wick and ALC, and I gave this album a decent 4.
My favourite tracks are Scratch Card Lottery, Her Hippo, and New Long Leg. My least favourite track is ALC, and I gave this album a strong 5 out of 10.
Next, we have Line Eon by Igloosghost. This is the sophomore album from the UK electronic producer. And I know that Igloosghost is pretty popular amongst fans in the electronic scene. And while this was the first thing I'm hearing of Igloosghost, I was hoping for great things on this record, as a lot of his previous stuff is pretty popular and heavily acclaimed. And Line Eon doesn't blow me away. Like, there is a lot to admire about it, but it doesn't blow me away personally. You know, Line Eon just, I don't know, it shows us that Igloosghost is incredibly gifted as a producer, and that's the case given the amount of incredible moments of sound design that we get here that feel very galactic and otherworldly, and with minor yet methodical nuances that make their way into the framework of these tracks, and we truly have something with color and grace. You know, the strings especially are a nice touch, and I love the way that the bass hit sounds. They're just really nice. But where it thrives in fantastic sound design, it lacks in coherence, as the album begins to get very tedious as it goes on, given how overcomplicated it slowly becomes, and it falters in its failure to remain memorable or engaging, as it was pretty easy to get thrown off by some of the ideas on here. Granted, they're good ideas, but they're ideas that don't really flesh themselves out into something distinct or coherent. You know, it for sure has its moments, and I'm interested to go back and listen to some of Igloosghost's other stuff, but for now, I don't even know how to pronounce this album's name, whatever. This album is decent, and it falters in some respects.
Yeah, Igloosghost's sophomore project is significantly more methodical and significantly more subtle than his debut, and this is an approach that, while sometimes pretty well executed, also suffers from having some significantly more sloppy and overproduced moments. There's plenty of tracks here that just kind of feel way too overdone and lose the atmosphere that the more slow-paced and subtle moments help to establish. You know, obviously complexity isn't a bad thing, it's just that a lot of them feel very all over the place and directionless in their complexity. It definitely still has some absolute standout tracks, and the more orchestral aesthetic to the whole project is definitely a nice touch. But as a whole, I think this project really fails to live up to his debut, and even that was personally a project that kind of has grown off me over the years. So yeah, I'm not really that fond of it, but also I do appreciate a lot of what he goes for here, and I do think it has some genuinely really nice moments. But overall, it's just a little too sloppy.
Fair enough. My favourite tracks from this album are Light Gutter, Amu Disc Mod, and Pure Grey Circle. My least favourite track is Soil Bolt, and I gave this album a decent 6.
My favourite tracks were Pure Grey Circle, Self, Fossil, and Amu, My least favorite track was EO Disc Ignite. I gave this album a light to decent 6.
Next we have Dancing with the Devil, The Art of Starting Over by Demi Lovato. This is the 7th studio album from the pop singer-songwriter. This is also Demi's comeback record after a very serious overdose that she nearly died from like a few years ago, and thankfully she survived. And this bit of context does feel a bit important in relation to this new album, as this is basically just filled with lyrics and themes that deal with her near brush with death and addiction, and I completely sympathize with her and commend her for addressing this as well as other introspective topics. But as far as the album goes, I can respect what Demi tried to do in this record more than I actually enjoy it. As to me, this is just plagued with issues that hold it back. While the lyrics are very heartfelt and personal, there's plenty of moments that feel very cliche in my opinion. It doesn't help that it's backed up by some very cliche production choices that don't really have much in the way of anything memorable or interesting. It's pleasant, but it's very plain for my liking. And while there's a few tracks that I think are pretty good in the track list itself, it's unnecessarily bloated with filler, especially with a lot of the tracks in the middle. And I feel like the album could have been decent if it was just cut down, but unfortunately that's not the case. It has its it has its moments, and I respect the hell out of it for the personal lyrical content, but I wish that it was packaged in a sound palette that was a little less generic and something that was a bit more concise in terms of its track list.
Yeah, I do understand that there is some genuine emotion behind this record, but my god, it handles absolutely none of that with the slightest bit of subtlety or nuance. And as you said, cliche lyrics are just the basis of this album. It's really just sloppily written in my opinion. I just does like only a few tracks really feel like, there was a lot of personal pain and suffering gone into them. A lot of the tracks feel like there's a whole production team behind them. It feels very manufactured, but that's not even the worst part. The worst part about this record is, I think, a lot of the instrumentals and performances. I think Demi Lovato just overperforms one boring pop soul track after another for a whole hour. It's really just, the sound palette of this project is so boring and cliched. It feels like I've heard all of these tracks 100 times over. I do appreciate like the meaning behind this record, but the music itself is just really, really bad in my opinion. It's an absolute struggle to get through for me, and especially considering its long length, I don't think it does much at all to justify it. There's practically no rewarding moments here for me. It's one of the weakest pop records I've heard in a while.
I mean, fair enough. I was a bit more lenient towards it, but it is what it is. My favorite tracks are I See You, The Way You Don't Look at Me, and The Art of Starting Over. The worst tracks are Anyone, Melon Cake, and My Girlfriends Are My Boyfriends, and I gave this album a light 5.
My favorite track was The Art of Starting Over. My least favorite tracks are Anyone, Lonely People, What Other People Say, The Kind of Lover I Am, My Girlfriends Are My Boyfriends, and I gave this album a strong 2 out of 10.
Okay, next we have Roadrunner, New Light, New Machine by Brockhampton. This is the 6th studio album from the alternative hip-hop and pop rap group Brockhampton.
Yeah.
The lads are finally back after a year and a half since Ginger. And I was just so damn excited for Roadrunner, but I was still kind of cautious going into it, as I was conscious of kind of overblowing the hype I had for this album. But when the album came out, now that I've heard it numerous times, I'm confident in saying that it's great. That might be the inner Brockhampton stan in me talking, but I don't care. I do think that, in some cases it does feel like a little bit of a mess tonally and stylistically, but I don't know, there's just way too many great songs on this album for me. I feel like Roadrunner, like I said, is a bit all over the place, and when you compare it to other Brockhampton albums, there's a clear sound and mood in mind, especially on albums like Ginger and Iridescence. But this does allow Brockhampton to be more diverse and explore other diverse sounds in its tracklist, like their usual pop rap and alt hip hop blends, as well as some hardcore hip hop, some West Coast influences, and given the production quality of the album, it certainly works in their favor. The group also incorporate plenty of features on this record, and while not all of them stand out, there's a fair amount of fantastic features that add to their respective tracks, like Danny Brown, JPEG Mafia, and Charlie Wilson. Of course, it wouldn't be a Brockhampton record without the group members themselves, and they deliver on the performance end of things, especially Dom, Kevin, and Joba. And of course, the lyrical themes on a lot of these tracks are very serious and heartfelt in that Brockhampton fashion, but some of the group's darkest moments are on this album, like especially the moments from Joba, which are just so disheartening. Fucking hell, man. And, the track list itself, it's filled with some fantastic moments that I've been playing all, month since it came out, and I guess I won't be getting enough of it. I won't be getting enough of Brockhampton's music anyway. But here, I really hope that the next album will still be quality.
It's about time we get to talk about Brockhampton on this channel.
Yeah, man.
Yeah. I've been a hardcore fan of Brockhampton since even before Saturation 1 came out. I hopped on the train when the singles for that album started gaining traction online, and I've been completely in love with the band's sound and aesthetic since, and also their personas, just their characters. They're not, it's obviously the real them, but just their characters are just so varied, so just out there, so personal. It's a group that I really connect with, and they've consistently released great project after great project. They've consistently remained one of the most exciting acts in contemporary hip-hop, and Roadrunner is absolutely no exception. Production-wise, it feels like the producers kind of let loose a little bit. It reminds me a little bit of every single era of Brockhampton put together. There's a lot of stuff production-wise that reminds me of the Saturation trilogy. There's a lot of stuff that reminds me of the more gritty stuff on Iridescence. There's a lot of stuff that reminds me of the more subtle and more just heartfelt stuff on Ginger. And I think, it puts all of those styles together to create something that's very unique. The sound of this album is very unique. It also, really follows in the footsteps of their previous albums, as it sees the band completely not shy away from, being very open about their emotion. Joba especially, who, recently lost his father to suicide. He's been going through a lot of healing in his personal life, and he does bring a lot of that healing, a lot of the confusion, a lot of the pain he's feeling onto this record, and it really is just breathtaking. It's spectacular just how open, just how how much he puts out there, and he's definitely been my favorite member for a long while, and this kind of just solidifies it. On top of Joba, I think Kevin absolutely kills on this project as well. He's kind of taken a back seat in some of the records. He's obviously still very omnipresent, but it's been a while since he's just stood out this much. But that being said, everyone else is on their A game. I do like how Jabari gets more of a spotlight lyrically on this project. I think it's interesting what the band's going for. And, it's a consistently fantastic project from a consistently fantastic group. And, not much more to say. I absolutely love this record.
Same. And my favourite tracks from Roadrunner are Buzzcut, Chain On, Bankroll, The Light, Windows, When I Ball, Don't Shoot Up the Party, and The Light Part 2. My least favourite tracks are Count On Me and I'll Take You On, and I gave this album a light 8.
My favourite tracks are Buzzcut, Chain On, Count On Me, The Light, Windows, I'll Take You On, What's the Occasion, When I Ball, Don't Shoot Up the Party, and The Light Part 2. My least favourite track is Old News, and I gave this album a decent 8 out of 10.
Next we have Fearless, Taylor's version by Taylor Swift. This is the latest album from pop singer-songwriter who at this stage needs no introduction. I'm sure everyone knows who Taylor Swift is, and her reputation precedes itself. And if you've been keeping up with her catalogue, then you'll know that not too long ago she released Evermore and Folklore, which saw her dabble in folk pop and indie folk, both of which were very good albums. And since then, Taylor has announced that she would be re-recording some of her older albums and taking back what was hers. And of course, that officially starts with a re-recording of Taylor's seminal 2008 album, Fearless, which features not only new recordings and original tracks, but also recordings and bonus cuts, which we have seen labeled as From the Vault, which are songs that, haven't seen the light of day. Now, when I heard the new version of Love Story, I was pretty hyped for this album, and in my opinion, it's still a pretty good outing from Taylor. The new version stays very faithful to the original, with compositions remaining the same as the original, and with its country pop and teen pop sound maintaining its presence, but it's brought into a setting that feels more akin to the production quality of the current year, and it kind of boosts the quality of the record, especially on some cuts that I didn't really care for on the original album. The songs are elevated by a more vocally mature Taylor Swift, who delivers some great performances throughout the album and often sells a lot of these tracks, although I will admit that despite me not taking the lyrics into account in this new version, they kind of work better in the original album, since it's coming from a more youthful voice, and that naivety lended itself better to that youthful voice. The From the Vault tracks are easily some of the best tracks in the album for me. The middle section with the bonus cuts don't really hit as hard for me, and while I like a majority of the album, I doubt I will revisit the entire thing given its length. But hey, there's plenty of fantastic moments and renditions on here that are quality, and that is undeniable for me.
Taylor Swift's reimagining of her 2008 album Fearless is somehow far better than its source material. Taylor recreates a lot of these old tracks with a new perspective and a new sense of maturity, and it really does give the teenage emotions explored on the original project a whole new meaning and a very bittersweet, nostalgic quality. Production and instrumentation wise, I think this project kills it. It sounds very pristine, very lush. Taylor vocally is a lot more mature than she was 13 years ago, and I think it really lends itself to the more pristine sound of the album. I do think that the project does kind of overstay its welcome, which brings it down a notch for me. And a lot of From the Vault tracks don't really live up to the rest of the album. Aside from Mr. Perfectly Fine, I think that track is great. But other than that, a lot of them just kind of add to the length of the album without really bringing anything exciting to the table. And it's a very long project, and I don't know, I just feel like this sound would have lent itself better to a bit of a shorter endeavor. But I do understand that she's trying to record all of her old tracks, so she's trying to get the bonus tracks in there too. She's trying to get her entire catalog on there, which makes sense. It's just when it comes to this album as a listening experience from start to finish, it is a little long.
I can definitely see where you're coming from there, but I really enjoyed the From the Vault tracks, honestly.
It's fair.
My favorite tracks from Fearless Taylor's version are Fearless, 15, Love Story, You Belong With Me, Tell Me Why, The Way I Loved You, The Best Day, Changes, and all of the From the Vault tracks. My least favorite tracks are Hey Stephen and You All Over Me, and I gave this album a strong 7.
My favorite tracks are Fearless, 15, Love Story, You Belong With Me, The Way I Loved You, Untouchable, Forever and Always, and Mr. Perfectly Fine. My least favorite tracks are You're Not Sorry and Today Was a Miracle, and I give this album a strong 6 out of 10.
Next we have Entertainment Death by Spirit of the Beehive. This is the 4th studio album from the Pennsylvania noise pop, neo-psych, and indie rock band. I'm not familiar with this band all that much. This is the first album that I'm hearing from them, but I have seen this album floating around the music sphere of the internet, and it's been getting mostly positive reviews, so I was curious to see what was the deal with this album, and it's pretty interesting. I do like it, but it doesn't really feel like something that I would go back to all that much. Maybe it has a chance to grow on me, but for now I just think it's solid. Now, to start with what I like, I think that this album has a consistent and tight flow that runs smoothly from tracks to track, and there's definitely a sense of completion and cohesion when you look at those aspects objectively. I like this band's blends of noise pop and dream pop, and they culminate in a way that with the psychedelic sound yet unhinged sound, and given how odd it is, it's only makes it even more chaotic and I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's structurally and fundamentally just odd, and I like it. Generally, I do like this chaotic sound and the ethereal soundscapes that the band create, and we get some spectacular moments from them. But I suppose it loses me in some places, since it's often way too incoherent for my liking, and the more straightforward tracks are pretty bland in my opinion. But besides that, I think that it has some fantastic and consistently good moments, but I have to see if I'd go back and listen to it again, because, I don't know, it doesn't seem like I'd go back to it all that much.
Um, yeah, this project is just kind of a revolving door of ideas, constantly moving from one, admittedly not fully fleshed out idea to another. And a large part of me can see why, a large part of me can see the very many flaws in this, but, while this project is completely all over the place, there's also a lot of really fantastic moments on here. And the last thing I can possibly say about this project is that it's uninteresting or boring. I just wish a lot of those interesting projects were a little better. Interesting moments were a little better explored. I feel like this album kind of doesn't know itself what it wants to do, what it wants to be a lot of the time. It's not very cohesive, and I think a project that is a little more fleshed out would have probably been a little more welcome. But even with all its flaws, there's certainly plenty of good stuff to hold on to here. It definitely makes the 36-minute runtime genuinely seem like it shouldn't be enough to contain all that this project has to offer. But again, I just think it should be a little more fleshed out because it feels very sloppy to me.
Okay, my favorite tracks from Entertainment Death are Give Up Your Life, The Server is Immersed, I Suck the Devil's Cock, and Death. My least favorite tracks are There's Nothing You Can Do, and It Might Take Some Time, Wake Up in Rotation. And I gave this album a light 7.
Yeah. My favorite tracks are Wrong Circle, Give Up Your Life, Rapid and Complete Recovery. My least favorite track is I Suck the Devil's Cock, and I gave this album a decent 6 out of 10.
Okay, next we have Ultrapop by The Armed. This is the 4th studio album from the Michigan band, and I want to make it clear that from the get-go, I am furious with what the band are doing with this album, because the album title and the album cover are incredibly misleading. I am disgusted that this album wasn't an album I was expecting it to be. I was expecting it to be some kind of indie pop album or whatever, but instead we got a good noise rock album and a post... Really? Actually, yeah. But instead we got a good noise rock album and a post-hardcore album, and I am fuming. No, for real though, this album is actually pretty good, but it does have its fair share of issues. For one, I feel like the album only really peaks at the beginning and the first three tracks, because they're genuinely fantastic, and while it has moments past that point and is consistently good, it didn't really do much to add any dynamic to the sound throughout its runtime, and its consistently overpowering sound gets kind of one note and forgettable as it goes on. But with that in mind, I like a lot of things about this album, like the production. It's incredibly aggressive, the dense and noisy sounds are great, and for what it is, it sounds pretty crisp. I also think the post-hardcore screams are generally great across the project, and it was a fun listen, even if it gets a little samey. I probably will only return to those few select tracks in the near future, and if I ever listen to this album again, I hope that grows on me, but for now, I just think it's fine.
Yeah, compositionally, there's some very good material here, but it's just a real shame that the production throughout is so unbelievably wank, because it's often quite hard. The production.
Really?
Did you not get
I like
that?
The production.
I fucking... No.
Oh.
It's so easy.
Wait a minute.
You can't even tell what's going... What?
Wait a minute. I'm getting confused here.
You alright?
Wait, is this a bit or are you actually being serious?
Yeah, I don't like the production.
Oh. Lame. I thought this was a bit for the misleading thing.
No, I do not like the production. It's so hazy. I know it's noise rock, but it feels like they put everything at the top of the mix. Nothing stands out. It just becomes a fucking hazy, just mist. It's too misty. I can't make out a lot of what's happening here. And I can tell that compositionally these tracks fucking kick ass, but there's just... the production just drags it down so much for me. Everything is way too fucking high on the mix all at once. You can't make out anything in particular. It just all sounds so thin, and just I get that it's supposed to add a bit of oomph and a bit of noise to the whole project, but having everything so high up the mix it makes everything drown itself out, and it just does not sound good in my opinion. Just consistently the production just kind of bothered me because, as I said, compositionally at its core, these are good tracks. Just the mixing didn't do it for me.
That's a good joke. I really like where this bit is going. I'll give your actual review.
No. I'm done.
Oh, yeah.
Mic drop.
Yeah, you're not done. You're not done.
Mic
You're not done.
dropped.
You're not done. Do your review right now.
Microphone
Do your review.
dropped.
Do your goddamn review right
it's
now.
on the floor.
No, it's not. Pick it back up again and give
on
your
the
real review. Give your real opinion.
Back problems, I'm not bending over.
Yeah, you are.
Best tracks?
Okay. My favorite tracks from Ultrapop are Ultrapop, All Futures, Masunaga Vapors, Average Death, and Where Man Knows What. My least favorite tracks are Bad Selection and Music Becomes a Skull, and I gave this album a light 7.
My favorite tracks are All Futures, An Iteration, Average Death, Fate and Medication, and Real Folk Blues. My least favorite tracks are Where Man Knows What and Music Becomes a Skull, and I gave this album a decent 6 out of 10.
Damn, if you hate the production so much, why don't you give it a 6? Shit.
I mean, I know these tracks are good. The production is like really the only thing that bothers me consistently.
I mean, fair, but I just find that a pretty high rating for all your criticisms of it. I find it weird.
Well, I mean, the tracks are great. I want to acknowledge that. Instrumentally, compositionally, it's very good, very strong. I do like the vocals. I just can barely fucking hear them.
Nice bit. Anyways, next we have Never the Right Time by Andy Stott. This is the 5th studio album from the UK electronic producer. And much like a few others, this is my first time hearing of Andy Stott, and this is my introduction to the guy's music. Yeah, I do know that he has some acclaimed albums, which I have yet to check out, but I've kind of been incentivized by this album to do so, as I thought this was pretty good, but it wasn't consistent. You know, a lot of what we get on here revolves around a lot of very moody and dark ambient soundscapes, alongside some ideas and sound that take some UK bass and ambient pop influences. And most of it is pretty good, and when it's at its best, I am fucking floating, especially on some of the more sparse, dense, and pure ambient tracks. I like the way that the album builds this atmosphere, and the way that it layers its ideas is often great, and you know, the appearances from some of the guest vocalists, including Alison Skidmore, are a very nice touch on almost every track that she appears on. And in general, the ideas that Andy explores on this album are pretty interesting for what they are. But where it loses me is in some of the ideas and how they're integrated into the music, as some tracks have these mixes and ideas that don't really flesh themselves out or even have a satisfying conclusion or direction. A lot of them just feel directionless and kind of loses its charm. And its soundscapes particularly just feel very, I don't know, blech, especially in the middle. But whenever the ideas are done well and executed brilliantly, then I'm having a great time with it, and I'm interested in seeing what other stuff Andy Stott has to offer. I like this.
Yeah, Andy Stott returns after half a decade with an album that, for me personally, is a little underwhelming. The sound of this album can be described in 2 ways. For those unfamiliar with his previous works, it's a ambient techno-infused, very subtle and very atmospheric UK bass record. And for those familiar with Andy Stott, it sounds exactly like Andy Stott. It just sounds like every other album he's released. Once again, sees him team up with frequent collaborator Alison Skidmore, whose vocal work he samples and intertwines with the very despondent and hollow instrumental work. It's enjoyable, yeah, but it's far from a record really worth writing home about for me personally. It's the first time I ever sit through a full record of his, but I've heard plenty of tracks by him, and from start to finish, there's nothing here that really caught me off guard or surprised me as, you know, as something that's a unique direction for him, something that it's just very expected, I feel, through and through. It doesn't really cover any new ground, but it's still decent, for sure.
I mean, fair enough. This is the first thing I've heard from him anyway, so I'm not really that familiar with his sound. So,
Well, now you are.
Now I am, and I'm probably going to listen to some of his other stuff.
Yeah, you should.
But with that in mind, my favourite tracks from Never the Right Time are Away Not Gone, Never the Right Time, Repetitive Strain, Dovestone, and Hard to Tell. My least favourite track is The Beginning, and I gave this album a light 7.
My favourite tracks are Never the Right Time and Don't Know How, and my least favourite track is Answers, and I gave this album a strong 5 out of 10.
Next we have Let the Bad Times Roll by The Offspring. This is the 10th studio album from the veteran punk rock band and The Offspring, and it's also been 9 years since their last full-length record. And I'm going to cut to the chase really quickly because this album is awful. It's fucking horse shit. And I really don't need to tell you that it's horse shit because it's pretty much set in stone that this is horse shit. It fucking sucks. Let the Bad Times Roll can be described as like father of all if it was being kept alive on an iron lung and forced to keep living. And that's because this album just continues the cycle of older pop punk and pop rock bands dishing out some of the same overproduced, trite, faux punk, cringy, annoying, and cliched rock music imaginable. Only this time the Offspring set the bar possibly to its lowest point yet, if we don't count the last two Blink-182 albums. Everything about this album is just bad to the next degree. The lyrics on this album read like some of the most redundant observations that a punk band could make in terms of politics. The quote-unquote humor is embarrassing, to say the least. The production sucks. The mixes for tracks like Army of One and Breaking Your Bones are fucking awful. When the mixes aren't total dog shit, the sound palette of the other tracks are just boring. They're overproduced. It's soulless. It's sucky to the next degree. The guitar work is rudimentary and boring. The riffs are basic as shit. The rest of the instrumentation may have some energy to it, but it doesn't help that the sound palette of the entire thing sucks the life out of what little entertainment value this album has. The cherry on top of the mountain of shit that is Let the Bad Times Roll is the vocals. The vocals on this album are trash. The processing on some of the lead singer's vocals is atrocious, and he's trying way too hard to pull off a good melody. It's just tragic. His falsettos are awful. End of. The only silver lining that this album has is that it's only 30 minutes, and if you're the masochistic type, knock yourself out with this album. But for what it's worth, I hate this album. It's easily the worst thing I've heard all year thus far, and I will be impressed if there's another album on the way that can top this, because this is shit. End of. Retire.
Yeah, the Offspring has some material in their back catalogue that I genuinely do enjoy, but this album is very, very, very far from that. The production is fucking dog shit. The instrumentals extremely painfully generic. The songwriting is probably the worst thing about this project. It's fucking unfathomably bad. All the mainstream pop punk bands, I used to listen to growing up now fucking sound like shit. And Offspring is honestly probably the worst of them all. I don't have much more to say.
Fair. I have no favourite tracks. If I had to pick, I'd say This Is Not Utopia, but that track is dog shit. Worst tracks are Army of One, Breaking These Bones, Coming For You, We Never Have Sex Anymore, In the Hall of the Mountain King, Hassan Chop, Gone Away, and Lullaby. And I gave this album a light 1.
My favourite track is Hassan Chop, and my least favourite tracks are Let the Bad Time Roll, and particularly We Never Have Sex Anymore. That track is a fucking holy
so
shit.
So bad. Such a fucking train wreck.
This album, a light 2 out of 10.
Such a fucking train wreck. And next we have, The Battle at Garden's Gate by Greta Van Fleet. This is the sophomore album from the notorious Michigan hard rock band and blues rock band and Led Zeppelin knockoffs, Greta Van Fleet. I'm going to be honest, I wasn't excited for a new Greta Van Fleet album at all, and that's not just because they're derivative as hell, but it's also because they aren't that interesting of a band. They're just boring pastiche of sounds that came before, and they hold on to that sound with little in the way of any personality. The singles for this album do tease that the band are straying away from being blatant ripoff of Led Zeppelin and trying to go in a more progressive direction, and I actually ended up enjoying the final single for this album, Broken Bells, but now that the album is out, I can't really say that I enjoyed it one bit because I just fucking hated this album. I disliked it so much. In fairness to them, this isn't the worst thing that I've had to endure in an album format this year. We literally just talked about The Offspring. But it is honestly up there as one of the most painful because that's all I feel when listening to this album from start to finish. Pain. This is even worse than their debut, honestly, and that's saying something. Greta Van Fleet attempts at bringing more progressive elements into their music, and it doesn't work at all because all they do is unnecessarily draw out these ugly power ballads to the point where they become painfully long-winded. Their musicianship, while competent, isn't entertaining in the slightest. The band do nothing memorable on that front, and they fail to invoke any sort of emotion from me, and it doesn't help that the mastering on the guitars is so fucking egregious. It's so bad. God, it's so fucking limp and compressed. Greta Van Fleet once again continue to be one of the most derivative bands around, throwing in cliches and pastiche from 70s hard rock and prog rock band that are incredibly stale, and again, the comparisons to other bands are evident. The track Built by Nations literally sounds like a Led Zeppelin track once again. There are passages and vocals on this thing that just sound like early Rush rip-offs. And I swear, there was one passage that, like, just straight up sounds like it was ripped off from Pink Floyd. And, ugh. And they just fucking homogenize it to the next degree. You know, speaking of which, that's the cherry on top of this monstrosity, like when I was on about the Rush ripoffs. The vocals. Josh Keats's vocals have never sounded as annoying as they do on the Battle of Garden's Gate. The fucker is an absolute terror throughout this album, and he only adds to the pain of the experience. His howling and his borderline yodeling is awful, and I'm not interested in hearing that. It's so bad. I hate this overindulgent, overblown piece of shit. I'm probably the only one who like dislikes this album as much as I do, but I just couldn't bear this for another 20 minutes, let alone an hour. It fucking sucks.
Yeah, Greta Van Fleet decided that being just a carbon copy of Led Zeppelin wasn't enough, and now on their sophomore project they decide to fucking play off every single fucking classic radio rock trope imaginable. You know, admittedly, I think this project is a little more tasteful and a little more bearable than their debut, which often left me just frustrated with how blatantly unoriginal and cheap it is. This one honestly just fucking bores me to death. You know, the ideas here would have sounded fucking overdone 45 years ago. They sound fucking just insufferable today. I mean, if Greta Van Fleet ever release a good album, I mean, I'll be in shock. I'll be in a state of shock.
Alright. So that's it?
That's it. What the fuck else am I going to say?
Fair. I did go on for too long there, but whatever. Best track on the Battle of Garden's Gate is Broken Bells. The worst tracks are Built by Nations, Heat Above, Age of the Machine, Like My Love, Caravel, The Barbarians, Trip the Light. What am I even saying here? I don't... That fucking track. And The Weight of Dreams. And I gave this album a light 2.
My favourite track singular was The Weight of Dreams. And my least favourite tracks were Age of Machine and Caravel. And I gave this album a light 2 decent 3.
Next we have La Maquina by Conway the Machine. This is the latest studio album from Buffalo and Griselda's very own Conway. Like I've said in the past, Conway is my personal favourite Griselda member, and his From King to a God album is one of my favourite rap releases of 2020, and as of late it has reclaimed the crown as my favourite Griselda release, and La Maquina is his second record this year, as he dropped another record with Big Ghost Limited, which was solid for me personally, and while I think La Maquina is pretty decent, it's not really a moment that will stand out as one of Conway's best in my opinion. You know, La Maquina in many aspects is similar to From King to a God. I say that as it's very similar because a lot of what Conway was doing on that album turns up on here, that being his decision to incorporate more diverse production and sounds in the tracklist while bringing some more hooks and commercially appealing moments too. But what differs on La Maquina is the fact that the album itself is blatantly shooting for that commercial appeal, given how trendy like trap beats appear throughout this album. Hooks in particular are very, very much so in that very commercial lane, and for what it is, I think it's fine, but it still tries to keep fans of that cold-blooded 90s sound inspired, like fans of that 90s inspired sound happy too. But honestly, all this album does is like bring all of these things to varying degrees of success. The production all around is tasteful. It has moments that feel a bit too derivative for me, like the opening track. It pretty much sounds like a beat that every Griselda like member has rapped over at least once. It's blatantly recycled, and if I have to hear it one more time, I'm going to lose my fucking mind. Same goes for tracks like Sister Abigail as well. Now, lyrically, a lot of what Conway is doing on here is very much the usual, with little in the way of any substance, unlike some of his previous records with Big Ghost Limited and From King to a God. And he's still got some great bars, but he's just kind of like phoning in for me this time. You know, the rapping doesn't really disappoint, but at the same time, Conway can definitely do better. I was hoping for a bit more, and there were a few underwhelming features, but when Conway is on his A-game, he does pretty well. You know, that happens on a few tracks on here, and I'll get to those my favourite tracks, but it's kind of disappointing to me that Conway couldn't really keep up the momentum. You know, the Griselda fatigue is probably a factor as to why I'm not really blown away, but for what it's worth, it's decent. I just hope that Conway pulls through with something more interesting next time around.
Yeah, this project again continues my trend of being quite lukewarm on Griselda projects. In a lot of places, my opinion on this project kind of aligns with other Griselda projects. I'm absolutely a fan of Conway's gritty and tight performances. His songwriting has some real attention-demanding moments, and while aesthetically the instrumentals on here are very pleasant, very entrancing, in a lot of cases it feels very derivative of previous Griselda beats. There's beats on here that, you said the same thing, there's beats on here that just give me deja vu. It feels like I've definitely heard them before. There are moments instrumentally where I think the production goes in some pretty fresh, pretty exciting directions, but for the most part, this project really doesn't push Conway's sound forward, yet remains to be an entertaining one to listen to. I would still say I do like this project quite a bit. It just isn't, quite what I'm looking for. I do think that Conway is insanely talented. I do think Griselda as a whole is an insanely talented collective. But I think their output again is so frequent that it's hard for me to really latch onto something. There's always something missing for me personally, and I think here it's kind of how derivative a lot of the instrumentals are. I'm just not really too blown away by them at all.
Fair enough, I kind of agree. My favourite tracks from La Maquina are Blood Roses, Clarity, 200 Pies, Scatterbrain, and SC Gang. My least favourite tracks are Bruiser Body, KD, and Sister Abigail, and I gave this album a strong 6.
My favourite tracks are Bruiser Body, KID, and Scatterbrain. My least favourite track is 330 Tip Off, and I give this album a strong 6 out of 10.
Next we have Californian Soul by London Grammar. This is the third studio album from the UK art pop trio. Now, prior to this album, I've never really listened to much of London Grammar's music. I've seen them around, but I was never really that enticed to go back and listen to their music. But now we have this new record, and that, I guess, now is the time. While Californian Soul for sure has its fair share of great highlights in its tracklist, it's ultimately a pretty okay album in my opinion. Firstly, I think that the album is very well produced. The songs on this album carry this equally melancholic vibe. It's cinematic and has this bit bass-driven bliss and groove to it, which is a very cool thing to see. And it works especially well on the best tracks. I think that Hannah Reid's vocals are pretty good for the most part. Towards the end they get dull, I will admit, but she has her moments that work with the instrumental palette of the album. Where it loses me is in some of its ideas that, that feel very, predictable. They get predictable real quick, and sometimes these tracks are just plain generic for what they are. The songwriting isn't really that interesting in my opinion. It's not really that attention grabbing, and the album has a habit of rehashing ideas and not really giving itself an interesting spin on anything. Nothing on this album is bad in my opinion, but London Grammar fall incredibly flat at points. I love the highlights, particularly on the first half of the album and the final track, and for the most part the production is pretty good, but I'll probably have forgotten about this album in about a week's time, which, since I've last heard it, yeah, I probably have forgotten about it.
This new London Grammar project, in my opinion, is easily the most dull and lifeless record they've come out with. I think this string work throughout does give kind of a deceiving impression that the instrumentals are a lot more lush and a lot more busy than they really are. But listening to this project, more than once, I do really notice that the instrumentals are very thin and very tedious in a lot of places. And vocally and lyrically, the album also really lacks any, standout quality in my opinion. It's definitely serviceable, it's definitely good, but I don't think it really is anything exciting, anything that is going to be remembered, a few months from now, let alone a few years from now. I do think that this album just doesn't really live up to their debut. I think they've slowly been just releasing, their previous album was decent, this album is kind of just meh. I think they've kind of been going on a path of just kind of tediousness, and they've kind of, their music kind of lacks that magic that their debut has. This project honestly just feels like a really poorly conceived Florence the Machine album at times. It's just not great at all.
Fair enough. My favourite tracks are Intro, Missing, Lose Your Head, Lord It's a Feeling, and America. My least favourite tracks are Baby It's You and All My Love, and I gave this album a decent 6.
My favourite tracks are Lose Your Head and Baby It's You. My least favourite tracks are Missing and Talking, and I give this album a strong 4 out of 10.
Next we have Ska Dream by Jeff Rosenstock. This is the 6th studio album from punk producer, multi-instrumentalist, and singer-songwriter Jeff Rosenstock. Now, I've already done a review for Ska Dream, so if you want to go have a look at that, then please do. I'd really appreciate that. But to condense my thoughts on this album a little bit here, Jeff Rosenstock essentially announced on April Fool's that he would be releasing a ska punk rendition of his last album, No Dream, on 420, and the mad lad actually did it. We actually got this album, and it's really good. The songwriting that we saw on the last album is very much the same. It's the same emotionally driven and devastating and personal writing that appeared on that record, and it's still very good. But the rest of the album, from the production to the instrumentation, essentially brings the ska energy back once again in a new landscape, and he did it really freaking well. Instrumentally, everything is on point here. The bass grooves are awesome, the guitar parts are rhythmic, percussive, and fun. The drums are sick, and the vocals from Jeff, once again, are very passionate, and I love it. The production is fantastic, but I also love how Jeff manages to add a whole new dimension to some of the tracks, especially with a lot of the tracks that take a more effect-heavy dub approach to some of the songs, and it adds a bit of intimacy to the songs. So yeah, in general, yeah, this album is just fun, fucking fun. And you know what? A ska revival is more than welcomed, honestly.
Obviously, the arrogant sons of bitches are proof enough that Jeff Rosenstock and ska are two peas in a pod, but I honestly would have never imagined that a reimagining of every single track on his 2020 album No Dream would work so well as a ska punk track. He really, incorporates ska elements into all of these tracks so effectively. I certainly enjoyed No Dream, but I think it lacked a little bit of memorability for me when compared to some of his other solo albums. And honestly, this ska reimagining just completely eradicates that. Every track on here is an absolute blast. Some tracks on No Dream, which honestly didn't stand out to me all that much, just have a lot more memorability to them on this project. Honestly, I mean, it's a bizarre project. I mean, reimagining an album you just released last year as a ska project is something that, is definitely in character for Jeff Rosenstock, but would be a little bizarre for most other artists. But I think he genuinely, not just as like a haha, this is fun, this is a fun gag, genuinely he pulls this off really, really well.
Yeah, I agree. My favourite tracks from Ska Dream are Ska Dream, Hornline, Pick It Up, Old Scrap, Monday at Back to the Beach, Checkerboard Ashtray, and Ohio Pork Pie. My least favourite tracks were Ska and Scram, and I gave this album a decent 7.
My favourite tracks are No Time to Skank, Scram, Ska Dream, Pick It Up, Old Scrap, and Ohio Pork Pie. My least favourite track was Monday at Back to the Beach, and I gave this album a decent 7 out of 10.
Next we have Geister by Paysage T-Fair. This is the 12th studio album from Swiss multi-instrumentalist, producer, and black metal artist Paysage T-Fair. And Paysage T-Fair's last album, Involved, was one of my absolute favourite albums of 2020, and to this day it remains one of the finest pieces of dissonant hell that I've indulged into, and I adore it. So when I found out that Paysage T-Fair will be making a new record and that was coming out soon, I was very excited. But then again, I was pessimistic because I didn't know how he was going to follow up an album like Involved. And while it may not be the daunting behemoth of atmospheric black metal that Involved was, Geister acts as a pretty good follow-up to that record with much more concise runtime and a different sonic approach. Geister sees Paysage T-Fair take their regular sound into more pronounced and riffier direction with a sound mix that allows the guitar work and vocals to be more clear and present. And for what it's worth, it sounds pretty good, and throughout its runtime, it's pretty solid. The heaviness of the riffage and the dissonant soundscapes coincide very well alongside each other, and the monstrous vocals only add to the dark sound. It's still atmospheric, it's still very riffy, and it's dark, and the tormented screaming from the vocals is great in my opinion. Generally, I like most of the tracks on this album, and I love the highlights, but I will admit that the album tends to get a little samey. It follows a formula structurally, and they oftentimes recycle some of the same riffs, and the only time we really see the tracklist deviate from the crushing black metal sound is on the final track, which is essentially a full-on dark ambient track. But besides that, I think it has some great moments to its name. It's no Involved, but it's pretty good to me.
Yeah, Geister definitely isn't unfamiliar territory for Paysage T-Fair. It's, as a whole, quite in line with its typical sound, but following up a project I adored as much as Involved a mere year later is always going to be a hard task. And I don't really think this project delivers. One of the most magical things about Involved for me was how it builds atmosphere and imagery with its brooding and dense soundscapes, but Geister just simply, doesn't strike me as anywhere near as effective in that field. And the shorter runtime also just makes this project feel a little underdeveloped and half-baked. And, while it's still a very solid atmospheric black metal project, it just doesn't quite capture that magic that Involved does. And admittedly, I don't think it tries to, but nonetheless, I don't think it's quite the follow-up, most people would have wanted, but it's still definitely a decent album.
I mean, fair enough. I'll respectfully disagree, but it is what it is. My favourite tracks from Geister are Schotta, Unda, Osha, Anders, Stampfa, Grusig, and Geister. My least favourite track is Schurig, and I gave this album a strong 7. Apologies for my horrible pronunciations.
My favourite tracks are Bluet and Grusig, and my least favourite track is Varza, and I gave this album a decent to a strong 6 out of 10.
Okay, next we have Nurture by Porter Robinson. This is the long-awaited sophomore album from producer and singer-songwriter Porter Robinson. Now, I only found out about Porter Robinson this year, and that was because of Album of the Year. They basically turned the album's page into a fucking chat room for a piss take, and from all the reviews I've read, people genuinely seem to love the shit out of this album. So I was curious to see what the hype was about and see why people were hyping Porter Robinson up so much. And to simply put it, I don't really buy into the hype. In general, I was really indifferent towards what he presented on Nurture. I can definitely see why Nurture and Porter Robinson in general appeals to so many people, and if you the viewer love this album, I'm happy for you. But the hype for this album for me was well and truly overblown, and in my opinion, it was underwhelming. And far too many moments on Nurture just feel way too overproduced, overblown, and derivative for its own good. And while I like the warm, hopeful soundscapes and some of the influences that went into the ideas on this album, a lot of the fundamentals that went into the songs and sometimes the pitch-shifted vocals just rubbed me the wrong way. I don't know, the maximalism and overproduction of this record just feels very detrimental to the quality of the record for me. And it just feels hollow, and it's a shame because it has some good ideas. It has good intentions. The songwriting feels a bit too rudimentary and simplistic. And I feel like it's fine. I get why people like it, but it's just fine in my opinion.
Well, I think this project's absolutely gorgeous, and it's one of the highlights of the year in my opinion. It's a very eclectic showcasing of electropop, glitch pop, folktronica, and house, just to name a few, and all of these genres are very tastefully combined and glued together with some of the most dense and lush production I've heard in an electronic record in quite some time. The production is absolutely stunning. It's almost a sensory overload of just bliss, sunshine, and serenity. It's very hazy, very dissonant, but yet so clear and so personal and emotional. It's a completely new direction for Porter, and I'm absolutely here for it. I do kind of understand where you're coming from, but personally, a lot of this record just really, really appeals to me. Songwriting, I think, is great as well, and this project just kind of captures the kind of aesthetic that I love about summer. In record form perfectly. Not many records do it as well as this project does. It's just a very comforting album, and I really do enjoy it.
I mean, I can kind of see where you're coming from there, but I don't know, I just don't care for it. I think it's overproduced.
That's fair.
Okay, my favourite tracks from Nurture are Lifelike, Look at the Sky, Get Your Wish, Mother, and Blossom. My least favourite tracks are Something Comforting, Unfold, and Musician, and I gave this album a light 5.
My favourite tracks are Lifelike, Look at the Sky, Get Your Wish, Musician, Mother, Mirror, Something Comforting, Trying to Feel Alive, and my least favourite tracks are Do Le Mi Fa Sol La Tito and Dulcite, and I give this album a light 8 out of 10.
Next we have Sweep It Into Space by Dinosaur Jr. This is the 24th studio album from the long-running alternative rock, indie rock, and noise rock band Dinosaur Jr. And despite having a career as long as this band does, I've never really heard of Dinosaur Jr. before this. And there are some, and I guess there seems to be a pattern with all these bands that I've never heard of, only getting to hear them for the first time now, because I really don't like what Dinosaur Jr. tried to do on this album at all. And I wish that my introduction to this band could have been better, to say the least. Swept Into Space is essentially an incredibly limp collection of poorly mixed and dated alternative rock pastiche. It's like if the Smashing Pumpkins were forced to kick out Billy Corgan and replace him with Dave Grohl, but Dave Grohl was only allowed to weekly croon over these songs. I don't think it's awful or even a terrible album. It's just so bland and uninspired. It also doesn't seem to help that the sound is like it is. Well, it's just poorly mixed. The mix on this album is so weak in my opinion. The instrumentation is fine, but it's rendered limp because the instrumentals just feel so far back in the mix, whereas like the vocals are more up front. It's weird. I don't like it, and it renders the sound palette of this album just very weak to me, very flat, very thin, and underwhelming. Like, the guitars have little to no colour at all, the bass is underwhelming, the drums sound buried in the mix, and it makes the core songs such a slog to sit through. Because I feel like if they were mixed better, then I'd probably get more out of it, but because the hooks are there, the melodies are there, and the riffage is there, but they just aren't great. The vocals aren't it either, they come off very flat and unenthused, and it doesn't help that the mix is so upfront. Songwriting as well, it's pretty bland in general, and I don't know, in general this album is just bland. I can barely even remember a single note or melody from this thing at all.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, at its core, a lot of the material on Sweep It Into Space isn't downright bad, and it certainly has some enjoyable and, just enjoyable instrumentation and songwriting. It's just too bad that the mixing is so limp that it's pretty much impossible to enjoy any of the instrumentation. The vocals completely overpower the instrumentals, and the fact that the vocals themselves are so mellow just throws me off so much. This record should not be mixed this way. It sounds awful. The vocals do not sound like they should completely overpower the rest of the fucking mix. They sound so mellow and kind of hazy that it makes no sense. It's such a pain to listen to, and there might have been some good material on here. The guitars actually do, I think the guitar work is fine, but it just should sound more gritty. It sounds so faint and undefined I think that the mixing alone just completely throws off this record. It could have possibly been better. I'm not really sure. The record we got, it's just not very good at all.
I totally agree. My favourite tracks from Sweep Into Space are Garden and I Ain't. My least favourite tracks are And Me, I Expect It Always, Take It Back, Walking to You, and You Wonder. And I gave this album a strong 3.
My favourite track is I Ain't. My least favourite track is Take It Back, and I gave this album a decent 4 out of 10.
Next we have Private Reasons by Bruno Pernadas. This is the 4th studio album from the Portuguese psych pop and progressive pop composer, arranger and producer. And this is also the first album that I'm hearing from Bruno, and this is the first album he's coming out with since his 2016 album, Who Throw Objects at the Crocodiles Will Be Asked to Retrieve Them, which has a ridiculously high score on Rate Your Music, and this new album as well has been getting very positive scores too, so much so that it's currently number 2 at the Rate Your Music charts, I think. And because of that, I decided to include it here just to see what the hype was about. And while I definitely admire some things about this project, I ultimately think it's a fine album. It's pleasant, but it's something that I probably will not return to at all. Where things go well for Bruno on this album is in a lot of the influences that get taken into the record, the styles that he goes over with his band in the arrangements and compositions. Bruno incorporates a lot of past sounds and styles that cover a lot of ground, whether we're talking about some classic psych pop, jazz pop, exotica, synth pop, and it's all packaged in this very progressive setting as plenty of the fundamentals and compositional elements center around lengthier songs and interesting passages, which I feel like are executed well to some degree. Instrumentally, the band sounds pretty great, and they do a great job with what they were given. Plus, generally speaking, there's some fantastic tracks and passages that work so well with Little Season in particular. That sequence is fucking beautiful. But there were moments on Private Reasons that lose me, and it loses me in some of its ideas and its production. A lot of the ideas that Bruno takes influence from, stem from a lot of classic sounds and styles, but it's not a bad thing at all. You but you have to make it your own thing and add a twist. Otherwise, you just come off quite derivative or at worst generic. And unfortunately, I don't think this album does that at the end of the day. It fails to find its own identity, and it feels like standard pastiche for me. Though the production also feels detrimental to the album. It's pleasant, don't get me wrong, but it sounds way too clean. It just sounds way too clean. The reverberated soundscapes are honestly just quite bland to me. They get incredibly tedious as it goes on, especially with the progressive lengths of the tracks, and not to mention the synth tones just don't sound good at all in my opinion, and they just pissed me off to no avail for some reason. I wish I could have gotten more out of this project, but unfortunately it just doesn't really captivate me with much. It has merit, it has moments, but those moments are few and far in between for me.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think this is a project that I have some serious mixed feelings on. It's really got a lot going for it. The eclectic array of styles and genres this project explores is immediately attention demanding. It's psychedelic pop with a lot of influence taken from progressive pop, dream pop, jazz, even exotica. But while it does manage to seamlessly combine all these styles, I don't think it does anything really noteworthy with a lot of the individual influences. In fact, I do kind of think it wears a lot of them on its sleeve, becoming a little saturated and pastiche at times. However, a lot of these tracks are simply carefree and infectious enough that it's easy for, this to not be too much of an issue. However, it's until you realize that this album is well over an hour, and honestly, by the end of it, it just really, feels like the album has given me all it really has to offer a while ago. And if not for the fantastic penultimate track, I think this album could have, pretty much ended after Little Season. It's a good record, but I do think it lacks a little bit of originality. It lacks a little bit of identity.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
My favourite tracks from Private Reasons are Theme Vision, Little Season 1 and 2, and Far Beneath Your View. My least favourite tracks are Family Vows, Fuzzy Soul, and Brio 81, and I gave this album a decent 6.
My favourite tracks are Family Vows, Little Season, both parts, and Step Out of the Light. My least favourite track is Far Beneath Your View, and I gave this album a decent 6 out of 10.
Next we have Typhoons by Royal Blood. This is the third studio album from the UK alt-rock and hard rock band Royal Blood. This new album here comes 4 years after their previous record, and, I've heard about Royal Blood before, seen their self-titled all over the indie kid topsters, but I've never actually gotten the opportunity to listen to much of their music, and I wasn't really that sure of what to expect from them with this new album, as all I could really hope for is for the best, but unfortunately I didn't really vibe with Typhoons in particular, at all. If you couldn't get the message already, I don't like this album. It's such a slog to get through for me, and it's all because this album is just very trite, derivative, substanceless, and, for lack of better words, just really fucking boring. The album itself seems to be shooting for a more, commercial appeal with very polished production, but it just acts as a huge detriment to the album's quality because the production on this album is so bland. It's way too squeaky clean for my liking, and it rendered these tracks to just this soulless slog that was hard to sit through. Not to mention, this album is just so derivative. It sounds like a freakish hybrid between Death from Above 1979, AM era Arctic Monkeys, and the White Stripes, and I'm not interested at all in listening to that, quite frankly. Not to mention, every track on this album sounds exactly the fucking same. There's a clear template, and it's a boring one at that. To give credit where it's due, the instrumental performance is good mostly, and this is definitely not the worst thing in the world. But goddamn, it was a hard fucking 40 minutes to stomach, honestly.
Yeah, no, I agree. Their back catalogue, I think, has some serious merit to it, especially their debut. But I think Typhoon really sees the band's sound grow rather tired, and considering even at their best moments, the band already drew a lot of inspiration from bands like the White Stripes and the Black Keys. It really makes Typhoons one of the most insignificant and average records I've heard all year. It never drives me mad. It's never, all bad. But so much of this project is just mid, just garage rock. It instrumentally just doesn't feel that fulfilling. It's well performed, but it doesn't really stick out as anything original, anything new, anything exciting. This whole project is just, if I could sum it up, it's just garage rock pastiche. You've heard a lot of this already, to be honest. I think most of us have. It doesn't really bring anything new to the table, and I just don't think it's very good.
Yep, my favourite track from Typhoons is Trouble's Coming. My least favourite track is Boilermaker, and I gave this album a light 3.
My favourite track is Trouble Coming. My least favourite track is All We Have Is Now, and I give this album a light 5 out of 10.
Next, we have Fortitude by Gojira. This is the 7th studio album from the French death metal and progressive metal band. And I've been getting into Gojira recently. I've checked out pretty much everything else that they've done before this, and I really like what they do. I like their style of progressive metal and death metal vocals. I think they have some great technicality in terms of instrumentation, and overall I think their music is very enjoyable. And while Fortitude may not be one of the band's absolute best albums, I still think that it is still pretty enjoyable, and it has some great jams in the track list. From a production standpoint, a lot of what Gojira tried to do on here is very clean, very accessible. There isn't that much dirt to be found in the mix, and they still keep that chunky and heavy sound that was present on their previous records, and I genuinely really like the guitar work on this album. Instrumentally, I think the lads do fantastic. The drumming in particular is fantastic. I fucking love the drumming. I think the vocals are monstrous too. And like I said, they attempt to bring more accessible and catchy tastes into their sound, and while it works in some cases, say Another World, and Amazonia, I guess there are just moments on this that are just straight up bad. A lot of the vocals that try to do this kind of accessible chanty kind of vocals and anthemic vocals just don't work at all. They just sound very homogenized and just don't work well to the band's strengths at all. It has its moments. I genuinely love a lot of the more heavy and just straightforward tracks, and all in all I think it has moments, but it's a bit inconsistent for me with those moments that are very kind of anthemic in particular.
Fortitude explores some interesting themes and contains some very thrilling and exciting progressive metal. But as a whole, I think it really peaks quite early. The first 2 tracks are fantastic, as exciting as Gojira have ever been in a while, but the album kind of spirals into a slump of very underwhelming and flat instrumentals and some honestly quite cheesily anthemic vocal work. There's passages on this project that are just very flat. They just don't really do anything exciting. They just kind of play to a lot of, again, I've probably said this about a few albums, a lot of prog metal tropes. It just sounds awfully generic. But, there's moments where you can really see that, the Gojira is definitely a very important band in the genre, and for good reason. The opening track in particular is fantastic. Amazonia, I love the influences, the various exotic influences on that track, but unfortunately I think the album just doesn't really spice things up after those 2 tracks, in my opinion.
Fair enough. My favourite tracks from Fortitude are Born for One Thing, Amazonia, Another World, what else? Sphinx and Grind. My least favourite tracks are The Chant and Into the Storm, and I gave this album a decent 7.
My favourite tracks were Born for One Thing and Amazonia. My least favourite tracks are Hold On and The Chant, and I give this album a light 5 out of 10.
Next, we have Khaled by DJ Khaled. Not enough Khaleds, if you ask me. This is the 12th studio album from glorified music executive and producer, quote-unquote, DJ Khaled. DJ Khaled makes albums so people can't play it, and you actually can't hear it. Driving in your car, you can't hear another car playing it. Go to the barbershop, you can't hear another car playing it. Turn on the radio, you can't hear them playing it. It's not playing everywhere. It's called terrible music. And it's called albums you can't actually hear the songs. Not no mysterious shit, and you can hear it. And if you get that reference, thank you. So, I don't need to tell you that this new DJ Khaled album is bad, but all I need to tell you is that it might just be even more of a mess than his last album, and that's saying something. It's the same formulaic crap a DJ Khaled album always presents itself with. The production is just even more shit, and the features are even more underwhelming. Too much Drake, too much Lil Baby, and I will never forgive the fucker for ruining Jay-Z's Heart of the City.
Honestly, what can I possibly say about a DJ Khaled project in 2021? There's no surprises here. It's just track after track of the most manufactured and tasteless and bland pop rap imaginable, just like his last few projects. It's not any worse than his last few projects. It's not any better. It's just his music kind of fucking exists in a vacuum of just absolute degeneracy and just normie, I don't know, white girl music. It's just not good. I mean, what am I going to say? I'm not going to analyze this deeply. It's not good.
It's not no mysterious shit. That's why you don't like it. Wait, do you really not get that?
No.
Oh, do you not remember? Have you never seen the video of like DJ Khaled getting pissed that Tyler the Creator's Igor beat him on the charts?
No.
There's like I'll send it to you after the podcast. But he's pissed that he didn't get number one and Igor did. So yeah, best tracks on Khaled are I Can Have It, Popstar, and Body in Motion. The worst tracks are Big Paper, Where I Come From, Thankful, and We Going Crazy. And I gave this album a 3.
My favorite tracks are Every Chance I Get. There's only one. My least favorite tracks are Thankful, Let It Go, Body in Motion, This Is My Year, Just Be Grease, and Where I Come From. I give this album a light 3 out of 10.
And our final album for today is If I Could Make It Go Quiet by Girl in Red. This is the debut album from indie singer-songwriter, and Girl in Red has been popping off quite a lot recently, thanks to a lot of her songs getting very popular on TikTok, so much that she's got well over 10 million monthly Spotify listeners at the moment, and some of her tracks have well over 100 million plays on Spotify, so that's huge. And I was very curious to see what the whole hype was about, you know, and what's so appealing about her work. And I kind of see where the appeal stems from in some ways, but honestly, I really didn't like this album. I disliked it, in all honesty. Now, I said earlier that I could see where the appeal lies, and if you're a fan of indie pop, then you might get a lot out of this. But honestly, it's not that special. It's very generic for what it is, and it doesn't help that it's bottom of the barrel and bland. The production on this album is generally very boring and hollow, sometimes overproduced. I couldn't remember a single sound from this album for the life of me, and because it was that bland. And what was even more bland was the vocals, which were very monotonous, nothing exciting going on in that department. All the vocals did was add to the boredom and unoriginal sound. Ideas on this album are generally non-existent. It feels like a rehash of ideas that I've heard already. I feel like what rubbed me the wrong way the most about this album, though, was a lot of the lyrics. You know, a lot of the lyrics on this album have this very depressive, melodramatic sentiment to them, and that's not the main issue with this album at all. Lyrics like that generally benefit artists and work in their favour. But the writing on this album just feels like very cliche, amateurish, uninspired, all around dull, unlikable in how mean-spirited some of them come off as. At times it's very laughable and, I don't know, just kind of forced. It just feels very forced to me. I feel like it's trying that hard to pander to a certain demographic of music listeners. I don't know, it just comes off like it's pandering to, like, appeal to those, like, I'm 14 and I'm depressed demographic as well. But I just don't get it. I really don't, like, feel like it's, I don't know, I just don't like the way it kind of panders to that demographic. So yeah, all in all, I didn't like this album at all. It's bland, it's unoriginal, it's unlikable. It's one of my least favourite records of the month and of the year, honestly. You know, the silver lining is it's not the worst thing I've heard here, and it's only 30 minutes. So that's it, I guess.
I am quite a big Girl in Red fan. I have been for a while. I've seen her twice in concert, once opening for Clairo and once as the headlining act. I am a fan. And I do think that her 2 EPs are some of the best bedroom pop / dream pop I've heard in the last few years. And she's always had a knack for very simple yet emotional and very dreamlike in the production songs. But her debut full-length LP doesn't capture any of the magic of her previous works. It feels too overproduced. The atmospheric, hazy aspects of her older material just don't really shine here. It puts too much emphasis on her songwriting, which a lot of the time here is just quite bad, to put it bluntly. It's not awful. It has some moments, especially the opening track. I do think a lot of this album is really unlike her previous work. It's a lot more manufactured and a lot more well produced and a lot more easy to digest to most average listeners. I mean, obviously, her older stuff is in no way, shape, or form experimental. It's very much accessible, but this just feels like very manufactured and very sterile. And as a whole, it's just quite an uneventful and very poorly conceived album. And overall, the highlights are few and far in between. It just doesn't really do anything for me. It in no way lives up to her previous EPs.
Fair enough. I didn't like any tracks on this album, so I have no favourite tracks. My least favourite tracks were You Stupid Bitch, Body and Mind, Rue, and Apartment 402, and I gave this album a decent 2.
My favourite tracks are Serotonin, Midnight Love, and Rue. My least favourite track is Why Did You Come and You Stupid Bitch, and I gave this album a light 5 out of 10.
Okay, now it's time to move on to our Best Song of the Month segment. We're going to go over some of our favourite songs of the month, obviously, and pick one definitive best. There's just a few things that I want to mention here as honourable mentions. I want to actually mention the entire Civilization 2 EP by Kara Benito. I thought it was very good. We have Slow by Black Midi, which was a single for their upcoming album. And Introvert by Little Sims, which is a really great track. It's for her upcoming album as well, which is coming out in September. But my song of the month is The Light by Brockhampton.
I want to give some honourable mentions to Porter Robinson, Get Your Wish, Jeff Rosenstock's Ska Dream, and Taylor Swift's Love Story. My favourite track of the month, however, is also The Light by Brockhampton.
Yes, let's get it. Okay, moving on to our worst album segment. We have chosen 3. We're going to start from 3 up to 1. And for my number 3 pick, I chose If I Could Make It Go Quiet by Girl in Red.
My number 3 pick is DJ Khaled.
My number 2 pick is The Battle at Garden's Gate by Greta Van Fleet.
My number 2 pick is Demi Lovato, Dancing with the Devil, The Art of Starting Over.
And my number 1 pick is Let the Bad Times Roll by The Offspring.
And I agree.
Fucking poggers, dude. Okay, now we're going to move on to our best album segment. I have chosen 5. We're going to start at 5, go up to 1. My number 5 pick is Ultrapop by The Armed.
My number 5 pick is Fearless by Taylor Swift.
My number 4 pick is Ska Dream by Jeff Rosenstock.
My number 4 pick is Godspeed at State's End by Godspeed You Black Emperor.
My number 3 is Geister by Paysage de Ver.
My number 3 is Jeff Rosenstock, Ska Dream.
My number 2 is Godspeed at State's End by Godspeed You Black Emperor.
My number 2 is Porter Robinson, Nurture.
And my number 1 is Roadrunner, New Light, New Machine by Brockhampton.
Ditto.
Fuck yes, dude. We've agreed on all 3 segments. Let's go.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's going to conclude today's episode. Thank you so much for checking out today's episode of the Taped Podcast. I really hope that you enjoyed. What were some of your favorite releases of April? What were some of your least favorite releases? With that in mind, the next podcast that we are going to be doing is an Outcast Worst to Best with a couple of guests, so be sure to be on the lookout for that. And of course, necessary links to our own stuff will be in the description, including our Rate Your Music, Album of the Year, our own YouTube channels. And with that in mind, my name's been Mickey T.
I'm Nostalgia.
See you!
Bye-bye.